Welcome to Design Santa Barbara. This week we are in Santa Barbara Design Center and we are once again joined by noted Santa Barbara historian and author Erin Raffy. Erin is going to share the history of some of Santa Barbara's most important events, including fiestas and old Spanish days. Thank you very much for joining us again. I appreciated you being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So I was always fascinated by fiestas. There's actually few events we have in Santa Barbara that it's epic.
It is epic.
And a lot of people come every year, and I've been here almost 30 years, and I go like, you can't see the same show 30 years in a row, the same thing. And yes, people do.
Yeah.
So if you would please.
Well, it is a great festival, and it is probably one of the oldest in California, if not the oldest, and it has so many interesting components to it. And it was started, how many years have we got? 90-something years now. It was started in 1924. And like so many festivals, it was started probably by businessmen. And businessmen saying, you know, let's get some people into town. But the interesting part was, in Santa Barbara, our big tourist season back then was during the winter. And everybody came out maybe as early as the late October. There would be people who would be the snowbirds from the East Coast. New York, Chicago, Pennsylvania, all those areas back there, Ohio. And they want to get out of the freezing cold. They pack up all their things on a train car, boxcar, ship it out to Santa Barbara and stay here during those cold months. And they'd leave around March once everything starts thawing out. But the business people here said, you know, it's so beautiful here during the summer as well. It seems a shame. There ought to be something that we could get started here. They'd had a couple of athletic kind of special events that had happened in the turn of the century. But now they would like to have something a little more serious, something maybe to rival Mardi Gras in New Orleans. So they're looking about what should be the theme. And one of the local editors from the local paper, Michael Phillips from the Morning Press, and he said, you know what we ought to call this, what we ought to base this on is our own history, the old Spanish days. That's how they referred to the 19th century period. And they had had a festival, just kind of a grassroots festival, a few years before that, around 1920 and 1921, called La Primavera. And the old timers in town, the families that went back for generations, had kind of created this artsy event where they dressed up in the costumes of their great-great-grandparents and sang the old Spanish songs, and they performed the old Spanish dances, kind of for themselves and for anybody who was caring to, you know, follow this. So now in the 1924, here's the business people, and this man says, we ought to call it the old Spanish days. And everybody went, oh, that's a great idea, because it's a theme. People will be dressed a certain way. They'll have certain kinds of food that's different, you know, Mexican, Spanish food. They'll have the costumes. The whole thing was just transfixing. People just loved it. Now, people say, oh, I thought we started Fiesta because the Lobero Theater had opened, and that's why we started Fiesta. Well, kind of yes and no. These people who were starting a special event for tourists were all on their own. They started this whole thing. Meanwhile, in the other corner of town, just like you have today, you have crossover, some people that are going to be on this organization, and they're also on this organization, and they also belong to this organization. So you have some of that crossover. And the Lobero was celebrating its rebuilding, and they are going to open with a big show in August. And Fiesta was originally planned for September. But as time goes on, it's a very new event, and they're trying to put on this, that, the other thing to be part of this festival. They were, you know, starting to run short of funds. So they said, maybe we should move this up to August and open at the same time, because people maybe will be attracted to come for the Lobero. So they hooked up forces and said, we're going to piggyback on you. Our festival is 3 days long. It'll take in place in the middle of your 2-week run of your show. And so that's where the crossover came. And so this festival has grown and grown, and like I said, they called it Old Spanish Days. Fiesta means party, but they called it Old Spanish Days. They didn't say come to Fiesta. They might say Old Spanish Days Fiesta, but if you look at the early posters, it's Old Spanish Days, Old Spanish Days. Now, if you were new to town and you didn't have relatives going back to the founding of the Presidio, then how are you going to get dressed up? Well, you might kind of fashion a suit together. Maybe you might go to a seamstress. But of course, remember, we had just been coming out of just about the time that the Flying A studio was moving down into Los Angeles. And we had Hollywood people up here all these years. So we knew about the Western Costume Company. So they would come up with a big truck filled with costumes of this era, and people would hop onto the truck, go through there, pick out something to rent, and then have their very fashionable costume to wear during that week.
Early 20th century Halloween store, basically, on wheels.
On wheels. Not Halloween, the fanciest, beautiful, beautiful designers who are building, who are designing costumes for Hollywood. So even if it's supposed to be the little peasant in the story of the Californians back in the 19th century, believe me, that would have been some hotshot designer doing that peasant costume, for the movie. So very beautifully attired.
I have a quick question, actually. This is probably interesting. We call it Old Spanish Days, and I've been hearing this for 30 years. It was Spanish-speaking people, but it used to be Mexico. So it was really not 19th century, wasn't...
So that's a very good question, because our Old Spanish Days that we are celebrating was under Mexican rule. So of course, the Spanish come here starting 1769 in Santa Barbara, 1782. Spain is the guy in charge. The people down in Mexico, because everything is under Spanish rule, and they get the idea of what they see in America, the rebellion. So they say, this is a good idea. We want to have our own independence, enough of Spain. So they rebel, and now Mexico has its independence. And now Mexico is also in charge of Alta California. But under that time period, under Mexico rule is when we have this very unique time that we call Old Spanish Days, just simply, as you pointed out, because the language was Spanish. The Rancho period took place, there's no hardcore dates for it, but under Mexican rule, because Mexico is giving out land grants where they're going to develop these ranchos, where they're going to raise the cattle, which is part of our Rancho period. And it ended when the cattle died off, probably in the 1860s from a drought. So that for sure was the end of it. Kind of started slowing down after the gold rush because the American Yankees come in. So let's look at Santa Barbara. So we've been under Mexican rule, and under Mexican rule, very little happened in Alta California. So people are just taking care of themselves because the Mexican government really isn't doing anything. They're building, the bad news is they're not doing anything. The good news is they're not doing anything. They're not interfering. So we're all kind of taking care of ourselves.
They had no interest to come out here. There was no gold found, and there is no oil digging back then. So
and
why would they come here?
They're just busy with Mexico, and they just want to make sure that nobody kind of comes in and tries to take over Mexico. They're just busy because that's the center of governmental gravity, so to speak. But now the Americans, after the gold rush, start coming into Santa Barbara, into California, of course, and then eventually and definitely into Santa Barbara. And when they come in, they are not content to have the adobe houses. They're going to come in as Yankees and build their wooden houses, right? So they start building that, and they build a city of houses, a little town. Prior to this, during the Rancho period, what people don't realize is there were no towns. There was the Presidio here from the Spanish period, Presidio here, San Francisco, Monterey, San Francisco, and in between there were no towns. So if you are coming along on your horse and you're trying to figure out where to stay, you're looking for another vaquero, cowboy, to say, where is civilization? And they will take you to a man's house and you will stay, for this very hospitable man who says, welcome, come stay in my house. But to go back to this period of the Americans coming in, it's very different. They come in and they start building banks, hotels. And the music is different. Instead of these quiet little guitar playing and these very serene kind of stuff, you come in with the piano and the honky-tonk and the big brass band and Sousa and all of this kind of aural dissonance compared to how peaceful it was before. And we bring in carriages, you know, we're getting more access to come into Santa Barbara. So at the end of that time period, the 19th century, people would say, remember the old days? When it wasn't before the Yankees came and messed it all up? You know, maybe they like all the new inventions, but still, remember that old, everybody knew each other.
They still do. People still say, you remember the old days?
That's right. And there they would call it, remember the old Spanish days. So that's where that term was just very kind of a natural grassroots response. So it didn't mean under the Spanish period with the Presidio soldiers and all that. It just meant this wonderful, beautiful time where everybody took care of one another. There is no government. There is no welfare to take care of someone. We just take care of everybody.
That's wonderful. I've asked that many people. Nobody knew it like you do. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So there's a lot more questions to be answered. We will be back after the commercial break. Stay tuned. There is more Design Santa Barbara after the break. On this edition of Michael's Minute, I would like to talk to you about mid-century modern furniture. Mid-century modern is described as the period between 1933 and 1965, in which designers such as Eames and Nakashima used clean lines and futuristic materials to propel design into a post-war era. At Santa Barbara Design Center, you can see and feel a variety of mid-century inspired furniture, including our signature leather chairs and recliners with classical wood frames. Accent them with side tables, day beds, ottomans for a slick, artistic look. Customize these pieces to fit your home perfectly. To bring mid-century modern style to your home, please visit us at Santa Barbara Design Center, 410 Olive Street.
Welcome to Rugs & More. We provide the West Coast with the most comprehensive collection of new, oriental, and antique rugs. Rugs are solid art investments and often become cherished family treasures. Our limitless inventory will warm up your home. Exotic or traditional, tribal or modern, our rugs weave stories through intricate patterns, compelling colors, and touchable materials. #1 in Santa Barbara for over 20 years. Visit us today at Rugs & More, 410 Olive Street in Santa Barbara.
Today on Michael's Minute, I would like to talk to you about fabrics. Fabrics are quite essential items for your upholstery and window covering, and we have a huge selection of them. We have Durali fabrics, Fabricot, my favorite Cravat, we have our own house fabrics, and we have Ralph Lauren. For indoor-outdoor use, we have many different fabrics, and I would highly recommend you to come to Santa Barbara Design Center to see the largest selection of fabrics in town. Santa Barbara Design Center, 410 Olive. Welcome back to Design Santa Barbara. This week we have Erin Graffy, the Santa Barbara historian and a wealth of knowledge, and she's talking about old Spanish days and fiestas. If you could please.
Well, we were talking about, yes, that fiesta. The original name was Old Spanish Days when they started the festival in 1924. And they were basing it on their own Santa Barbara history the previous century, and a time period that they referred to as the Old Spanish Days, when people spoke Spanish. It was actually under Mexican rule. It was after the Spanish rule, but it was under Mexican rule and into the American period. But when people still spoke Spanish here, and the majority of people were still living on the ranchos, and this was the time period that they were looking back because of the the innate music that was developed here, the dances, the style of the way of life that was so unique. And it's a fascinating time period. It lasted maybe about 40 years, start to finish. And to kind of set this up, in Santa Barbara, this time period was so revered that even today when you go throughout Santa Barbara, you will notice in all the public arenas, on the walls, in the restaurants, the paintings all harken back to this time period. Now you might say, well, that's just kind of like what cities do. They put a picture of something in their history. But we don't show tons of pictures of Santa Barbara during the Wild West days or during the 1920s. It's all of this time period from around 1820s through about early 1860s that we're referencing here. And this is what you see when you go through the restaurants, when you're in El Paseo and you see the beautiful canvases in there, and it's describing visually what this time period was about. I actually wrote a book about this, The Old Spanish Days, and talks about this history. And when you go through this, all the illustrations are from our public arenas that have these images of that era captured so beautifully in the paintings and on the tile work. But what made this time period so interesting, just like I said, about 40 years is all it was, and it's unique in all of world history. It was probably the largest non-nomadic pastoral society, so people are raising, for the most part, it's cattle. There was a certain amount of sheep being raised, but 85% of it, I would guess, was just cattle. They're raising the cattle for the tallow and the hides, the leather, and they are actually trading with ships that come from all over the world, but particularly Boston and Europe and South America, but a lot for Boston. The ships would come around the end of South America, back up, and to come here, and they'd spend maybe a year going up and down the coast to trade. And remember, in this time period, under Mexico, and before the Americans come, we have no banks, we have no towns, so how are you going to do this business? It's all barter, it's just trade. Right. So these ships come in and they're loaded up with material so the woman can sew their clothes, maybe some beautiful dresses that might have been made in advance, maybe from Paris, but probably clothes, furniture, dishes, because we had no stores here, nothing. So they're going to simply trade. So one of the deals is they come to trade, let's say to come to California, to come to Santa Barbara, and they say, yes, we will give you this, so much for these hides, for this, and maybe there's a shortfall. They want more, the locals want more furniture. And they say, we owe you another 200 hides.
Wow.
They owe it, and they know that that ship is going to take another year. It could be 2 years before they come back. And these people from Boston were just flabbergasted that they could come back here and that the Californian was good for his word. His word was his bond. If they didn't have all this fancy paperwork and master charge and everything else, no checks because you can't, there's no banks. And yes, the person says, I owe you 100 to start off with. In fact, the hides were called the California dollar because we don't have cash, it's just everything is barter. But to go back, here's something else. California is very isolated. First you have the Rockies, then you have the Sierra Madres, so it's difficult to get into California by land. And trying to come up and down the coast, especially to Santa Barbara, can be difficult. But there's not tons of ships in this era because we are so isolated. We have the 4 places where the presidios were, maybe 1 or 2 little areas of just kind of residences, but California is very sparse. So if you were traveling through for whatever reason, you might have come by ship just out of curiosity, or you might have come up from Mexico, and you're coming through and you see a vaquero, and you would say, where am I going to stay? The vaquero says, come with me. We go up to the rancho, the man who owns the ranch, and he will say, welcome, stranger. My house is your house. Mi casa es su casa. You're going to stay here, and he tells his vaqueros, I have a guest who's staying at my house. Go out and tell the other neighboring vaqueros, big party at our rancho. Big party at Rancho Graffy. So if I have my Rancho Graffy, and I am inviting you to come stay at my ranch. I am not expecting you to pay anything at all, and in fact, if your horse is tired or you don't have a horse, I will probably give you one of my horses, because the generosity of the Californians knew no end. It was just, everything is open, we are taking care of one another.
That sounds good. Where's the address?
And because you are at my house and you are a stranger, you have news of the outside world. We have no towns, we have no TV, radio, even newspapers. We don't know what's going on. If you come from Mexico, that will be interesting. If you come from the east part of the United States, that'll be interesting. If you come from Europe, no matter what, you have information and something interesting to tell us. So the vaqueros who are on these ranches, the land grants would be, I'm sort of backtracking here a second, the land grants that were given from Mexico to people who applied for it were huge. They were 4,000 acres to 48,000 acres. So if I have my ranch, and even if it's only 4,000 acres, that's plenty, and my horsemen, my vaqueros, are working the cattle around here. There's no roads, so they are on a horse all day long, and if I need to get to another ranch, they are going to ride to the end of the ranch and to meet the next people, but there's no fencing involved, right? So it's just wide open, but I recognize the other vaqueros, and they're going to tell their people to say, big party at the rancho. So now when you come to my ranch, all these other people are going to come up, and the sort of the theme that we have behind our Old Spanish Days Fiesta today is based on this. You are the foreign visitor who's coming to our local town, and because of you, we are throwing a party for ourselves. But we're happy that you're here because you are the excuse for it. And today we see that when the tourists come in. But interestingly, you see the way our fiesta is, it isn't designed for a tourist. It's actually designed, everything that you go to is, I mean, tourists can enjoy it, but it's not packaged and aimed just to please a tourist. It's all just about entertaining ourselves, and that we're happy that you're here. Because there are no fences, this brings up some of the tradition of the Great Horse Society that we would have during this Old Spanish Days period. If you don't have any fences, how can you tell which cattle belong to me versus you on your ranch? So this is why they would brand the different cattle. So they would put, maybe it would be either my initials would be branded into my cattle, and the roundup would happen every spring, because now the ships from Boston are coming out because the water is thawing out and they can get out. They're going to come to California starting in the springtime. So we are going to start our cattle slaughtering, and we are going to brand the other cattle. The baby calves will follow mother, so that's how we know what about these new cows, we know where they're going to belong to. They're going to belong to me. And all the cowboys come together, the vaqueros. The Spanish is vaca for cow, so they say vaqueros. But interesting, they would pronounce it with the Castilian, vaca, vaquero. Later on, when the Americans come in, they mispronounce everything, right? Like in Santa Barbara, Castillo Street and Carrillo Street instead of Castillo and Carril. And they would mispronounce the vaquero, and that's why you get the word buckaroo, because that's the Americans messing up the pronunciation. So when you have the annual roundup, the cowboys will get all the cattle into one area, separate it, so that's where you have the separation when they do those. Even in the rodeos today, all of those things in a rodeo are built on the tradition of, if you're raising cattle, you actually have to do this. You bring them all together, you separate them out, then you have to rope them, tie them, get them down to brand them. And after all that's done, the men are hot and dirty and dusty those days, and they'd start showing off their roping skills, or getting on a horse and going so fast and then stopping it, just seeing if they can impress the girls. And those items of showing off become the modern competition of the rodeo, done in the circle, rodeo, because you're just showing off. So we see, of course, in Old Spanish Days to this day, we have the rodeo part of our festival. And the last bit would be on the horses, because if you're on a horse all day long with no roads, and you're chasing after the cattle, and you're dodging bobcats and gopher holes and all the bramble, et cetera, you would get pretty darn good as a horse person. And the people that would visit California in these days were absolutely fascinated to see how incredible people were on their horse. They say, even the woman, you should see how the woman get on a horse and just jump over everything. Boy, they would put our East Coast women that we think are so proper and so good on the horses. Because, of course, there were no carriages. Everything had to be done on a horse. And these expert equestrians, they said their style was not like the Americans who had controlled the horse with the reins. They had a rein, but they are so, sort of at one with the horse, because if you were on the horse all day long, you really could feel everything, and they would just know to nudge the horse with their knee or take their hat off, more sort of a dressage style of horsemanship. And these people were renowned as these excellent horse people. And today in our fiesta, we see that it is the largest equestrian parade, regular parade in the United States, perhaps the world. And we have all different kinds of horses in there. It's the most amazing collection. My friends that come to visit that are horse aficionados are just amazed when they come. They say, we've got the Clydesdales, which is the big, huge horses, big, huge hoofs, and we have miniature horses. We have the Pasafinos, with the beautiful gait, Arabian horses. And one of the early presidentes for our modern day Old Spanish Days Festival, a man named Dwight Murphy, he actually breeded the Golden Palomino back into existence. And of course that was featured prominently at our fiesta, in our fiesta parades. Even today, we see those and we point out that these were developed here in California, Santa Barbara, for the fiestas.
No, that's fascinating history that I'm sure our viewers are going to enjoy, and a lot of it we didn't know, although we are living here for many decades. I thank you very much. Erin, this has been wonderful. Thank you for being on our show and talk about the history that makes our home, Santa Barbara, so special. Thank you.